and happy first day of class. Thank you all for coming. In case you don't know, I'm Luigi Zingales, and I'm the faculty director of the Stigler Center. And today is the first initiative of the year. We're happy to host Benjamin Egerod for a mini course on the political economy of Revolving Door. So first of all, thank you, Benjamin, for joining us. Before we start, please note a few things. First of all, we are on the record and live streaming, so please silence your phone and remember that all the comments we are for eternity. And as usual, the views expressed by our guests are their own, not those of the Stigler Center or the University of Chicago. Now, as you know, and in case you don't know, it's the beginning time to start knowing, the Stigler Center promotes and diffuses research on regulatory capture and the various distortion that special interest groups impose on capitalism. And actually, Revolving Door is a particularly important topic, so we're very thankful to Benjamin to present his brand new research on the topic. Besides these mini courses that will be regularly advertised, we have many initiatives, including the Capitalist podcast that co-hosted by Kate Waldeck and myself, and the Pro Market blog, so please check them out. There is also one event in particular that I would like you to highlight. On Thursday, October 10th, we will host a conversation with former Minister of Finance of North Macedonia, Dragan Tverdovski, on how to build a capitalism that works for all in Southeast Europe. Back to this afternoon, we look forward to hearing from Benjamin's insights. Before we begin, please allow me to briefly introduce our guest. Benjamin is a researcher at the University of Copenhagen in the Department of Political Science. He's also a Stigler Bradley Fellow after receiving our PhD dissertation award last year. His research examines the role of political connections in interactions between business and government. His dissertation focuses on the US Congress and how post-political career ambitions change the behavior of legislators in office and how political connections can benefit large American firms. Please join me in welcoming Benjamin. Your mic, right? Yeah. Thank you, Luigi, for the welcome. And I'd like to start out by saying that I'm very happy to be here. I'm honored to have been invited to give this talk, or the series of talks on the political economy of the Revolving Door. So, first of all, the focus of the lectures today and tomorrow are going to be on the movement of public officials into private sector jobs. So you can think of potential revolving door dynamics in a lot of different ways. You can think of officials moving back in, lobbyists moving into politics, and you can think of revolving door dynamics in the private sector as well. So the stuff I'm going to present for you is going to be a mix of my own research and a bit of other new stuff that's being done at the moment. So as you'll see, this is actually a field of research where we know relatively little, but a lot of very, very interesting stuff is being done at the moment. Today I'm going to focus on what we could call the supply side of the labor market for political people with a political background, and I'm going to look at the behavior, and I'm going to look at selection effects. Tomorrow we're going to look at the business side of things, why companies choose to hire people with a background in politics. So let's get started. I'm going to start out by looking a bit, taking a deeper look at how much money there actually is in the revolving door. This is going to act as our motivation for the talks both today and tomorrow, because as we'll see, revolving door jobs can be extremely lucrative. Then we're going to take a look at how pervasive the revolving door phenomenon actually is. So how many officials walk through the revolving door, and how has this developed through time? We will see that the revolving door phenomenon is actually a pretty new thing. We're also going to look at the selection effects of the revolving door,
So we're going to start out by looking at how the potential for lucrative employment in the private sector shape the movement of legislators in particular into private sector jobs. But we're also going to see how this potentially affects the quality of office holders and therefore the type and quality of representation that citizens receive. Finally, if we get through everything, I'm going to talk about the incentive effects of the revolving door. So do people who are about to leave office for revolving door jobs, do they actually behave differently before they do so? Let's get started. You all know this pretty man. No? He was senator of Indiana. He was also the governor of Indiana for a while. His name is Evan Bayh, and after he had held first the governorship of the state and then represented the state in the U.S. Senate, he left office for a series of revolving door positions. He has both worked as a registered lobbyist and has worked as on boards of directors on several large companies. One of the things that makes Evan Bayh an interesting case to examine is that after he had been out of office for 6 years, he chose to run for his old Senate seat once again. Because of this, he had to file disclosure forms about his assets and his income during the 2 years before he has run for election in 2016. They showed that his salary in those years were $6 million. That is, Evan Bayh made a lot of money in his post-elected life. Some media coverage suggests that he made even more immediately after he left office, maybe as much as $10 million in 2011 and 2012. Now, this is an anecdote. It's an interesting anecdote, I think, because, well, he's an interesting figure in U.S. politics. One of the stated reasons why he left office, left the Senate in 2010 and 2011 was that he thought that politics, the culture in politics had gotten too partisan, but it had also gotten turned into a money-grubbing culture. This is interesting when we look at how much money he made himself based on his career in politics. Now, how many Evan Bayhs are there in American politics? That's an interesting question to ask, because first of all, as I said, Evan Bayh is an interesting anecdote. But if we want to really learn from the case of Evan Bayh, we need to know whether this is a general feature of the American political economy. Is it the case that it generally is this lucrative to have a background in politics and to leave office? Now, a different way to ask this question is to ask how valuable is political experience in Western contexts. And there's been done some very interesting studies in this. So one thing that I want to mention is research by Andy Egerod and Jens Heimgüller, who shows that in a UK context, serving in the UK House of Commons actually doubles lifetime income for people who did so. That's pretty extreme. A bit closer to home, Ben Palmer and Max Schneer from Max Palmer and Ben Schneer from the Boston University and Harvard University, respectively, have shown that being elected to the Senate increases the probability of going on to later serve on boards of directors by 30%. They also dig into how much money former U.S. senators are paid on boards of directors, and they show that they are paid approximately $250,000 a year. When you take into account that these positions, that they generally work approximately six hours a week, this is a very, very high salary. It's not that different from other people on boards of directors of high performing companies. But it is pretty striking that many of these people who transition from the Senate into serving on boards, they actually they have no experience being CEOs. They have no experience managing large companies. Their main experience comes from their political service. Now, why does this matter? I want to couch this discussion in saying that there's nothing wrong with high salary jobs. And there's nothing wrong with politicians leaving office to take high salary jobs, not necessarily. And it seems that a lot of the discussion in the media and a lot of the positions that are advanced by political commentators and pundits implicitly assume that there's something inherently corrupt in high salaried labor for former politicians. I don't think that's the case, but I still think that it's important to look at it. Why is that? First of all, because these jobs are so lucrative, they are likely to shape the type of official that holds office. If legislators respond to varying degrees to the lucrativeness, it is also likely to shape the kind of politician that remains in office. And if the future employers, they seek to hire specific kinds of legislators who have a certain track record, this can also incentivize certain behavior among the people who are about to become revolvers. Finally, as we will look at tomorrow, there's also the question of why firms hire them. Why are they willing to pay these huge salaries for people with a background in politics? Presumably, these firms act rationally and they don't throw money out the window, so they're going to get something in return. We're going to examine that tomorrow. Okay, so this is the roadmap. The lecture today is going to be on, as I said, the supply side of revolving door labor. We're going to look at the value of employment to legislators, how much money they can make from it, and how that shapes retirement decisions. And then we're going to look at how these career ambitions, they also shape behavior. Tomorrow, we're going to look at the firm side. And we're going to look at what's the select benefit that firms get from hiring these people. Okay, let me start by talking a bit about how pervasive the revolving door is in American politics. So first of all, this is a graph from that Jeff Lashl's made with his co-authors. And it shows the evolution of the revolving door in the US Congress. If we look at the latest years, what we see is that across the Senate and the House, between 40 and 50% of legislators that leave office, they become lobbyists. They become registered lobbyists. This is likely to be an underestimate because many of these people, they go on to work on boards of directors with obvious political components to their jobs. They also avoid registering as lobbyists to a very high degree. What I want to point your attention to is the beginning of the graph as well. So if we look back to the 1970s, there practically wasn't a revolving door in American politics. When we move into the 80s, it starts to get going for the US House. And when we reach 88, it explodes for the Senate. Something happens there. I'm not sure. I don't think anyone knows exactly what happened. But something happened that set the revolving door going in the late 80s. And that feature of American politics has lasted until today. And now it's probably most of the people who retire from office who go on to hold some sort of position as a political operative in the private sector. let me show you a graph of bureaucrats turned lobbyists. So this is data from a much from a shorter time period. So we start in year 2000. This data collected by Josh McCrane and Alex Bolton, and I should probably have put percentages of all registered lobbyists out here, not just the total number of lobbyists. But in 2018, there were approximately 11,500 registered lobbyists on K Street. That is, American bureaucrats turned lobbyists make up approximately 10% of all lobbyists, registered lobbyists on K Street. That's huge. And when I saw this data, I had to stop up and think what was going on. Because remember when I said earlier that this is actually a pretty new phenomenon. We don't really know what's heads and what's tails and what's going on. This is potentially huge, and this is, this working paper. It isn't even released. No one knows the actual consequences of this. It also, one thing is the revolving door from Congress into lobbying. Another thing is the revolving door among bureaucrats into lobbying, which is, first of all, it's understudied, and until this data only recently became available, and well, it's huge. And basically, this is one of the most important, I think, motivations for studying the revolving door. We know that it's there. We know that it's pervasive, but we still don't have a handle on why does this phenomenon take up such a large part of modern politics? What are its consequences? We don't know. So let me dive into one of the things that I believe is a potentially very important consequence of the revolving door. That's adverse selection effects. So it should be pretty clear that the quality and type of official that chooses to serve or remain in office shapes the kind of representation that citizens receive. Now, if the revolving door lures officials out of public service, that's going to create more competition for the labor of politicians. If it lures different types of politicians, so if different types of politicians are heterogeneously receptive to this kind of very lucrative post-elected employment, it will also change the quality and type of office holder. Now the problem is, well, the first order question I think that we need to ask in this situation is whether officials are actually attracted by high salaried post-elective jobs. It's not enough for us to show that they do make a lot of money. We also need to show that a change in the money that they would make if they were to walk through the revolving door actually induces them to walk through the revolving door. Otherwise, it might be totally coincidental. People could leave office for other reasons and then go out to make a lot of money. You need to remember that most people who serve in the US Senate and the US House of Representatives are already extremely wealthy. The problem when we want to investigate this is that we don't observe the distribution of rewards that are available behind the revolving door. At any given point in time, we don't know what job offers that a US senator is presented with, what kind of money he would be able to make if he chose to walk through the revolving door. This is a tough inferential problem, and I'm going to show you a bit of my own research where I try to deal with this. This is on the US Senate. It could be extended to look on bureaucrats and members of the House as well. And I depart from the idea that when a current senator observes how successful her former colleagues who now work as lobbyists are, she forms ideas based on that about how well she would perform if she were to walk through the revolving door. So I collect two kinds of data. First of all, I collect post-elective career trajectories of senators. So which kind of jobs do senators leave office to take? And I also leverage lobbying tracts that former senators work on. So these are made available under the Lobbying Disclosure Act. And a nice feature of this data is that we can see exactly how large these lobbying contracts are. And that we can use that to build a proxy of how successful former senators are when they lobby. And I use that to show that when the senator's former colleagues get more successful in their lobbying jobs, former senators, the serving senators are more likely to walk through the revolving door. This establishes a baseline. I don't think this is the most interesting result in this project. I'm going to move on to the selection effects in a bit. But it shows that US senators, even though most of them are multimillionaires, they still react to the potential for good employment in the private sector. Importantly, however, they only react to them when opportunity costs to remaining in office are high. The way I get at this is I look at, so the pension scheme that are offered to members of Congress, it gets very much more lucrative at 3 specific points in time. So when we look at, and that happens at specifically 5 years of tenure, 20 years of tenure, and 25 years of tenure. Interestingly, when they are close to receiving a hike in the lucrativeness of their pension scheme, they do not respond to outside career offers, which is intuitive, I guess, but it informs us about what the processes are and potentially what we can do to limit the movement of people out of office and into lobbying. But how does this affect selection? Now I'm going to look at a number of different proxies for quality or the effort that legislators have exerted while they were in office. So in this graph that I'm going to build up in a second, on the horizontal axis, we have how many bills these senators have sponsored on average throughout their career. Now, senators, one of the biggest jobs they have is basically writing legislation. If you are interested in engaging in production of legislation, you're probably likely to write a lot of bills. And on the vertical axis, we have the effect of outside career options. So I'd like to hear what your expectations are in this situation. Would you expect that the effect goes down with their bill production, or will you expect it to go up, or will you expect it to remain the same across all levels? Yeah.
I would assume it would go up because they're being incentivized to vote one way or another, right? So putting things out there, but it could go both ways actually.
It definitely could, and it actually goes the opposite direction. I mean, it was a good bet, and when I went into this project, I wasn't sure which direction to expect, but it goes the other way. This is interesting, right? So if we look at the effects that I presented in this graph, what we see is, if we look at the shaded area, the gray shaded area, we see that this is a confidence interval that estimates basically the uncertainty around the estimates. We see that the effect when you have, on average, introduced about 20 bills throughout your career, for each Congress throughout your career, that is, relatively speaking, you've been less legislatively productive than the average senator. We see an effect that so if contract sizes in the lobbying industry go up by about $90,000, you become about 8% more likely to, 8 percentage points more likely to walk through the revolving door. This is a pretty huge effect when you think about how many senators there are in total, and especially when you only look at senators down here. The effect continues to gets smaller until it disappears for the very most productive senators that there are. The cool thing about this is that it replicates across a variety of different measures of legislative effort. So this is called the legislative effectiveness score, and it captures not only how many bills that the senator has introduced, but also how far the senator has managed to push bills in the legislative process. That is basically how hard and how skillfully have they worked to see their bills become public law. Again, we see that the senators who have not managed to push their bills very far in the legislative process, they react much more strongly to outside career options, and the effect disappears when you have been very legislatively productive. We can also look at a centrality measure. So this is basically a measure of how many co-sponsors that senators have managed to drum up support for their bills. And once again, it's the same story, right? When you have not been very central in the network of co-sponsors in the Senate, there's a strong effect, and this effect disappears when you've been very good at drumming up support among co-sponsors.
But sorry, is this conditional on leaving office or unconditional?
This is unconditional office. So this is
conditional.
No, so this is the conditional effect of outside options on the probability of leaving office. So this we have out here.
This is combined. If you produce a lot of legislation, you're more likely probably to be re-elected.
Probably. It's but I mean these are the people who leave office voluntarily, right? And it's averaged throughout their entire careers. So minus the last term in office, because we'll see that matters later. Yeah.
I'm curious, does this have like year and senator fixed effects? Because okay.
These are from standard differences models. And the cool thing, if we want to talk about identification in this situation, is that because the private sector career prospects or the contract sizes that other senators work on are shaped way outside of the reach of these current senators, it's actually a pretty good candidate for a dose response difference in difference. Okay, so, oh yeah.
When you say voluntarily leave office, are you including people who have very tough re-election campaigns or know they're likely to lose?
I am, but I'm not going to show you the robustness checks here, but I run a bunch of robustness checks that shows that it's not, these effects are not driven by the effects of being in an election year, having a strong opposing candidate, or having a hot primary. So I think this basically shows that there are selection effects to the revolving door. Interestingly, though, it is the type of legislator who is most attractive seems to be the type of legislator who has been the least legislatively productive throughout their career. Now, this is not necessarily what everyone would expect, and I think there are two potential ways to interpret this. So first of all, it might be that the kind of legislator who values legislative work a lot is simply just less attracted by outside career options. Whereas the type of legislator who doesn't value legislative work is attracted to a very high degree. It could also be, and we'll talk more about this tomorrow, but it could also be that the revolving door simply attracts specialists. So people who to put in a lot of work in committee, they will, for instance, tend to be less legislatively productive, broadly speaking. Yeah.
Is there a party effect in all of this?
Actually, both parties tend to respond equally. And there is a slight tendency for Republicans to move through the revolving door to a larger degree than Democrats, but I'm not really sure what drives that. But they respond to outside career options in the same to the same degree. Okay, so let's talk a bit about incentive effects of the revolving door. So I think that in the public debate, this is probably the stuff that is discussed the most. Does the revolving door or the incentives, the career incentives inherent in the revolving door, do they change the behavior of legislators while they are still in office? Incentive effects are extremely difficult to make inference out because we don't actually observe, we observe behavior that's induced by the incentives, or we infer that changes in behavior are induced by the incentives. I'm going to look into behavioral changes on 3 different levels. So I'm going to look at the ideological patterns in the vote that senators do, the roll call votes. I'm going to look into legislative effort, if they exert more or less effort when they are about to walk through the revolving door. And finally, I'm going to look at the content of the bill sponsor, and we see that the bill content becomes more pro-business. It becomes more pro the future. Now, let's look at voting. So on this graph, we have the number of Congresses remaining until the legislator, the senator, this is the US Senate again, until he or she's office. And on the vertical axis, we have a measure of how extreme or moderate they vote. So in the bottom, around 0, that's the most moderate that you can become. That's like right smack in the middle ideological spectrum. And on the top, that's the most extreme that you can become. Okay, so if we start up by looking at where they place themselves, or how they behave furthest away from they leave office, they're they're pretty extreme. This goes for both parties. It's the American system is very polarized, as you know. And as we build up until we get to the time when they leave office, we see a trend where they become slightly more moderate. And then when they leave office, the moderateness shoots down. So this behavioral change in the final Congress is double the size of any other change throughout the career. And if I had plotted, so these are the voluntarily leave office. If I had plotted a parallel graph here with people who leave office because they lose re-election, you would see that it evolves totally in parallel, but you don't see the same moderation in the final term. Now this can signal a bunch of different things. What I want you to take away from this is basically that this is what I think is an important stylized fact. The revolving door, and in the paper, which I can relate the papers if you want after the lecture. The revolving door induces moderateness in the legislators who choose to walk through it.
This is moderateness across basically subjects, so it's both abortion and on business, or just one of the.
Yes, so this is one of the standard measures of ideological patterns of roll call votes. So what I use here is a version of the DW nominate score. So this is what they use is all roll calls, but the dominant interpretation of the ideological scale that you retrieve from this technique is about economic issues.
Because as a counterfactual, it would be interesting to see whether they change their position. Because one thing it could be that I get older and I get more moderate as I get older. First of all, the discontinuity is strange. But the other thing is that whether I don't get more moderate on civil rights issues, but I do get more moderate on business issues.
Yes, that would be a very cool extension to make. I'll show you some other stuff, hints at what's going on, English speaking, but I'll get to that. Come again, sorry? Oh.
Yeah, so you said that you explained the time trend for the people who lose election, but is the time trend different or similar for the people who leave but don't run for re-election again? Because this would also be consistent with people pretending to be more extreme for the electorate.
So when you look at people who just leave the labor market after they retire from office, you see a parallel trend, but a discontinuity in the opposite direction. So they become retirees, basically people who go on pension become more extreme when they leave office. And that's consistent with a large literature in the political economy that looks at final term behavior of politicians. So basically, once you know that you are going to leave office and not run for re-election again, you become unaccountable to your voters. So you move away from the political ideal point of your voters, and you exert less effort and stuff like that. The interesting thing here is that we observe the exact opposite pattern among revolvers, right? So they, and we'll see in a bit, they also exert more effort than they otherwise would have done, more effort than people who go on pension when they leave office. And let's go to that now. So what I'm going to show you here are the changes in behavior right before senators they leave office. And the behaviors we're going to look at now are legislative effort. So first of all, if we look at the number of bills that they sponsor in the final Congress relative to all previous Congresses, they sponsor about 20% more bills than they otherwise do. If we contrast this with people who leave the labor market, leave office to go to retire, there is a pretty strong tendency for them to sponsor fewer bills. There's quite a lot of uncertainty in the estimate, but it's a pretty strong tendency, and it maps well onto the wider literature on effort effects of leaving office. We can look at the centrality measure as well. So how hard do legislators who are about to walk through the revolving door, how hard do they work to drum up support among co-sponsors? They work harder. And pensioners, they tend to work a bit less hard, but not very much. If we look at whether they're absent for votes, there are no differences in effects across these two types of politicians. And there aren't differences in effect when we look at cross-party co-sponsorship. So how much do you work across party lines? There's nothing there. But it does show that there are pretty strong effects of being about to walk through the revolving door. So when you know that you're about to leave office, you tend to work harder on sponsoring more bills and seeing those bills passed than you have previously in your career. And this contrasts with people who are not about to move into the private sector. This is also consistent with a literature on the revolving door, which has mainly focused on the private sector, which shows that there are large incentives for revolvers to signal competence when they know they are about to change jobs. It seems that this replicates in a political setting as well, which is important. Yeah?
Maybe I misunderstood the earlier finding, though, in that revolvers are generally less legislatively productive, correct? But towards the end of their tenure, they really start to ramp up and start to form some of those relationships that they're going to need when they become a lobbyist. Is that what you're...
Yes, exactly. So what we saw before was the average throughout their career, with the final Congress excluded, and we saw that people who throughout their tenure have been less productive, they react more strongly to the potential for lucrative private sector employment. What we see here is that this same group of legislators, when they are about to walk through the revolving door, they start exerting more effort. Okay, so One way to think about the moderation result that I showed you before is to think about this in terms of future employers. I'm not saying this is the only thing that's going on, but it might be part of it. Importantly, business interests are, at least the business interests that hire revolvers in the US, tend to be more moderate than the legislators themselves have been throughout their career. Now, if what they do is, if what senators who are about to walk through the revolving door, what they do is vote more in accordance with their future employers, that would be consistent with this. We test this. So what I'm specifically going to do here is I'm going to measure the policy preferences of future employers by using data that Adam Bonica has collected, where he estimates the ideological preferences of 14 million campaign donors based on who they donate to. And then we're going to see whether revolvers, they move closer to the preferences of their future employers in their voting records right before they leave office. And they do. So the estimates in these graphs, they show what I call convergence. So if you think about this as two ideal points in space, you have the revolver here, and you have the future employer here. Then what we use is a distance metric, right? And what happens when they are about to leave office is that they move about 25% closer to the future employer in the way they vote. This could be driven by a lot of different things. I'm not going to say that the moderation result is only due to this. So one problem in this is that people donate strategically, especially business interests. They're going to donate across the board, and that's going to make them seem more moderate than they might actually be in real life. So a different way to investigate whether the change in behavior, whether the revolvers become more pro-business before leaving office, is to look at how the market reacts to the bills that they sponsor. Specifically, what I do next is that I retrieve all the data on all the bills that revolvers sponsor, and I'm going to take out the dates. Then I'm going to look at the stock market reactions in narrow windows of days to the stocks of the future employer. So basically, what we're going to investigate here is whether when senators introduce a new bill, does the stock price of their future employer increase? And if we look at just 2 days around the date of introduction, we see a slight tendency to increase. It's pretty noisy, so we can't reject the null of no effect. But there is an average change, an increase of about 1% in the stock price of the future employer. If we look at a placebo Congress, I just took out the median Congress, all the bills that the senators sponsored throughout a median Congress, we find, if anything, a negative effect. Let's try to decrease the bandwidth and look on more days around the date of introduction. What we see is that if the estimate becomes less noisy, as evidenced by the confidence intervals. That makes a lot of sense. We have more days to work with. And it becomes statistically significant at the 4-day mark and remains at around 1%. After that, the effects increase and they remain positive and statistically significant on all windows of days up until the 10-day mark, where I don't estimate more models. This is a pretty important finding, and maybe I should have led the day with it, so you all kind of glossy-eyed now. So I'm going to walk you through this a bit. What happens here is that when a senator sponsors a new bill in her final Congress before leaving office, the market reacts positively to that when it comes to the stock of a future employer. So the stock price increases by, about 1%. but the effects vary a bit. How we interpret this effect is a bit difficult, but I think my preferred interpretation is basically using investors as a crowd that content codes the bills that are introduced. So it's pretty impossible for us to read through the bills and assess all the potential effects that these bills could have. But if we look at market reactions, what we can see is basically that the market expects that the revolvers, or soon to be revolvers introduced, that if they were to pass, they would benefit the future employer. Yeah.
Sorry if I missed this, but at what frame are you looking at that 1% move in stock price? And then do you have any additional data on how the stock performs if the bill does not pass?
I haven't looked at, I haven't conditioned on passage of bill, but I'll do that in a future iteration of the paper. What do you mean by time frame exactly?
So you said the stock moved 1%. Is that 1% in a week, a month? Or
These are on days. So I subset the data to look at between 2 days and 10 days, and that's where the price movements are as well. Okay. I want to end the talk by saying that Michael Shepard and Heyong Yu have found relatively similar patterns on the staffers and lobbyist levels. So there are effort effects as well there, and future employers tend to gain more access to the members of Congress that staffers turned lobbyists work for. And Elizabeth Kemp has looked and found similar results on the career paths of credit raters, who tend to perform better before they transition to working for an investment bank. I'm going to skip this. And then I'm just going to wrap up today, and then we're going to do some more Q&A. So what I want you to take away from today is basically that career incentives, post-elective career incentives, they do matter for legislators. They exert more effort. They become more pro-business before leaving office. And there are also selection effects that differ for different types of legislators. So the least legislatively productive, they tend to be more attracted by lucrative revolving door positions. What are the normative implications of this? It's difficult to say, because, for instance, more effort in our legislators is a good thing. It might be a good thing if what is happening is that we're weeding out low productive senators. It might not be the case that that's what is happening, but it is one interpretation. And finally, it's not pro-business behavior isn't necessarily bad. We can see that, for instance, the majority of the population tends to be more aligned with the preferences of the average special interest group in the middle of the political spectrum than many of the very extremist members of Congress. It also raises some questions about how to regulate this, because we run into second best problems, right? Because there are positive effects there are positive incentive effects and there are negative incentive effects. So if we take the most dramatic regulatory action, which is advocated by some people, that we just close the revolving door, bar private sector employment, we're going to run into a lot of other problems because there are actually a lot of positive sides to the revolving door. Tomorrow, we're going to delve into the firm side of this. So we're going to look a bit more on what it is that firms gain from hiring former members of Congress, and under which conditions they gain from it. Finally, I'm going to present some of my own work where I look into the mechanisms that bring about the gains. Thank you for listening, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Yeah,
Yeah, so in an earlier slide, you had shown that the revolving door is a newer thing, and that over the past 10 years or so, bureaucrats have been more likely to become lobbyists. Have you drawn any connection to the increase in partisanship? Because if you were in a very extremely partisan Congress, staffers are more likely to feel ineffective and want to leave.
Yes. So I haven't drawn any connections to this, but some work by Tim LaPira and Trey Thomas digs into this, and I'm going to talk a bit more about that tomorrow. But I think you're very right that some of the things that they show is that there might be a polarization story to it. The interesting part is, though, that the effects are kind of mediated. So when you see increased polarization, one of the empirical co-occurrences with that has been that you've seen less funding for legislative staff, salaries have gone down, and legislative skills have been concentrated with leaders, with party leaders. So basically, what they argue is that that's what's driving the push out into the revolving door. I'm not sure if the trends for bureaucrats, the salary trends for bureaucrats are quite the same, but it definitely matches up well with legislative staff. Also, there is so John DeFigueiredo has done some very interesting work on public sector personnel economics, and he presented here in the spring. And what he looks at is so basically what you expect to see is that in election, when regime changes, you expect the high-level bureaucrats to transition into the public sector, but the low-level bureaucrats to stay. And he shows basically that that's not the case. So what you see is that even low-level bureaucrats tend to leave public service once they become politically disaligned with the president. And that might be driving some of this change, right? Because obviously, in this period, there's been a steady increase of polarization. So if you, as a bureaucrat, don't like working for a polarized president that you disagree with, then you're probably going to be more likely to leave office, right? Yeah.
I think in the slide immediately prior to this, that started in the 70s, it tracks a pretty steep upward climb, and I wanted to know, I was noting like the founding of Black Manafort and Stone, for example, was in 1980. Are there any other major historical or regulatory points in that arc that you see as contributing to the upward trend?
There probably are. I think that the explanation that I've had in mind myself is because it's only the very, very steep incline is only for senators, so it's more steady incline for the House of Representatives. And I think that there's been done some very interesting work by Lee Drutman, who tracks. He wrote a book called "The Business of America's Lobbying," where he tracks the rise of corporate lobbying in the U.S. And what he basically found is that throughout the 70s and 80s, public affairs companies and lobbying firms, they started to create their own demand among large companies. And I think historically it co-occurs very well with this rise in the revolving door, and I think it makes sense to me at least that when the demand for political operatives increases in the private sector, it would make sense that that would co-occur with the revolving door in politics.
Yeah.
Have you been able to compare this research to all the research being done in other countries?
I have not. So there's not a lot of research being done in other countries. I'm doing. I don't know if you have anything in mind.
I was just wondering. Well, is there anything like? Does that say anything about the fact that maybe this phenomenon occurs here, but not in other countries?
So there is some evidence in the European Union at the level of the European Union that the revolving door that there aren't as large gains for lower level bureaucrats and staffers to walk through the revolving door. But there still are gains, especially if you're at the top of the hierarchy. I've done some research myself that shows that that interest groups can gain a lot more access to the European Commission by hiring former members of the Commission as well. So I don't think that this is a strictly American phenomenon. I think we have enough anecdotes to conclude that it's pervasive throughout Western politics. But I think that America is an extreme case, that it's much more pervasive here and much more lucrative here than in other places. And we simply don't know. We don't know a lot about the consequences here, and we know even less about the consequences other places. Yeah.
So my question was related to that, in the sense that I think the reporting requirements were strengthened in 1992 for reporting lobbyists. And so it's possible in anticipation of that, more people begin to report. Right?
I think that was in 96, right? So the LDA was passed in 96 and enacted into law in 98, which occurs with this hike in but I don't know what were your thoughts on it?
Well, no, it seemed like if it's 96, I guess it's less of a problem. But if it's 1992, in anticipation of this, it's possible that the increase in reporting was just due to basically foreseeing that they would at some point have to report.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know it was later.
Yeah, just curious, were there any particular data points you had difficulty acquiring and any angles that you were theorizing about that you just found it was hard to get good data?
Yeah. So that is very, very difficult to come about in this setting. So the problem is that registered lobbyists make up a relatively small fraction of the total number of lobbyists out there. And particularly since mid-2000s, where the regulations were strengthened, you've seen a rise in what we call shadow lobbyists. That is, lobbyists who lobby without registering. So that's a very big problem for collecting data. Similarly, when you go into the private sector and do obvious political work, but work on boards of directors or on boards of advisors and stuff like that, you're not going to register, and that's a problem if you want to collect data on it. What was your question about the theorizing?
Just if you had any particularly strong theories that you just weren't able to test without enough data points.
Right. Yeah, so I think something that we're going to talk a bit about tomorrow is I think that the revolving door has probably some of its most important consequences when it comes to enforcement. And it's one of the core areas that I'm interested in when it comes to enforcement is the enforcement of tax policy. And the data on bureaucrats I don't know if you know, but BuzzFeed has obtained data on all American bureaucrats dating back to the 70s and through a FOIA request. And members of staffers at the IRS were exempt from that FOIA request. So it's going to be extremely difficult to look at how hiring a former IRS staffer affects the enforcement of tax policy. But we're going to look a bit into tomorrow how hiring a former member of Congress affects the enforcement of tax policy. I think we're going to have to close up here, but thank you for your attention, and I'll see you tomorrow.